Hello. So we are carrying on with Durkheim, and in our previous lecture we spoke about his sociological method and the social fact. Today we are going to speak about the book that he wrote 2 years after his book on the sociological method, where he takes up suicide as a social fact and looks at its various causes and rates in society. So before I begin, I do want to recognize the fact that this is a very sensitive topic and that some of you may feel uncomfortable talking about suicide, especially if this is something that you have witnessed with a close one, in which case I really would say prioritize your own self and either have someone with you or skip this. But it's not suicide at a personal level that he's talking about, but the notion of suicide rates and how they are both relatively stable across societies and that they change at particular moments in history. So that's the idea that he's trying to get across to us. So your call, you decide whether you want to sit in on this lecture or you would rather skip it. Now, for the most part, we think of suicide as a very, very personal decision in one's life, right? Like what can be more personal than taking one's own life? And yet, Durkheim decides to treat it as a sociological subject. So what does he mean when he wants to look at suicide as a sociological inquiry? And how does he take something so personal, so intimate, something that concerns a person's life and death in order to make a sociological inquiry? So that's what we are going to speak about today. His text that came out in 1897, titled Suicide, A Study in Sociology, is both a study, an excellent study of the rates of suicide, the varying rates of suicide, but also a brilliant demonstration of the method that he tries to advocate for in terms of how does one do sociological research. Out of the theorists in the early phases of sociology, especially let's say Marx and Weber, that we are bringing in from the canon, it is mainly Durkheim who actually claims the title of sociologist for himself. So I just thought this was pertinent to mention. And he, in this study, very systematically shows us how does one do such a study. So I'll begin, and I'm quoting some bits from his text because in the first introduction itself, he is outlining what are the different reasons because of which suicide occurs in a particular society. And very systematically, one by one, he looks at the reasons that are there in the public domain that people might attribute suicide to. And then if he finds evidence or not find evidence, depending on that, he keeps that reason. So he says first, what he wants to eliminate what he calls extra social or aspects that are not social but are attributed to rates of suicide. He says first, what could be the extra social and social causes of the phenomena? Second, he says we determine the nature of the social causes, the way they produce their effects. So first he'll eliminate, and I'll show you the ones that he's eliminating. And then he zeroes in on the social causes, and then he says we will attempt to determine how it is connected to other social facts. So if there is one social fact that is attributed to higher or lower rates of suicide, then what other social facts is that social fact connected to? So really, really important methodological innovation that is happening over here. I mean, we now do with all kinds of software and detailed statistical analysis, we do multiple regression analysis. Here he's taking so many different factors and trying to find the connections between them. So very quickly, we will attempt to determine how it is connected to other social facts and the means by which it is possible to act upon it. So that's what his book is about. And in this systematic study, he also wants to very clearly define suicide Now, suicide is not something that is so easy to define. I mean, from let's say from the movies that you might have watched or any other TV serials that you might have seen, there is, or news items for that matter, it is oftentimes the police or the investigator is having a hard time determining whether the cause of death is a natural death or there's something that needs investigation, or whether it is suicide. I mean, unless of course somebody leaves a suicide note. Was the amount of sleeping pills that the person took accidental, or was it deliberate? There are lots of different questions that come in terms of what counts as suicide. So he does what any good sociologist would do, or any scientist would do, is first define that fact that they are trying to study. So let's look at his definition of suicide. He writes, suicide is any death which results directly or indirectly from a positive or negative act by the victim, and the victim should know will produce such a result. So directly or indirectly could be that somebody very clearly engaged in an act of suicide, or let's say starved themselves to death. So that would be something that they did not pay attention to their health, even though they knew that it would cause death. Similarly, for positive and negative, somebody could take a positive action towards killing themselves, or could refrain from doing something such that refraining would cause death to occur. But one of the central points in this is that the victim should know that it will produce the result. So there is a very strong intentionality attached to the definition of suicide. So the extra social causes that he one by one eliminates, starting from that, oftentimes we think and we would say that, so and so was suffering from a mental illness, was seriously depressed, or had other mental illness issues, and therefore it resulted in suicide. He eliminates that by showing how rates of suicide across societies pretty much remain constant, and that if it was such an individual cause, then why would these rates remain constant or vary across particular regions? While being in a situation of mental illness could make one susceptible to committing suicide, but it is not the cause, he says. It can increase the vulnerability, but this is not the reason, he shows through evidence, that can be attributed to rising or decreasing rates of suicide in a particular society. Remember, this is a sociological study and not a psychological or a study of an individual. Durkheim is drawing from several studies here. He's reading psychological and medical literature on suicide, but he's also looking at statistical and other empirical material that he gathers across societies. He then looks at the weather and climate. Sometimes we think that if the sun does not come out and the mood is bad, and therefore it might lead to more suicides, and he very quickly eliminates that. He eliminates hereditary or genetics as a reason, drawing on medical literature for committing suicide, and he eliminates astrological kind of movements that such a particular position of stars might cause more people to commit suicide, as some people believed around the time that he is writing. So he very systematically eliminates all extra social causes of suicide. And then he starts to show us through several maps, through empirical studies, through statistical data, of how the distribution of the rates of suicide are in particular societies. So I have some examples of these excellent maps from his book that I will show you now. This one, for example, is the average number of suicides per million inhabitants in France, and he studies them. He makes a connection here once he studies the patterns to see that in the Protestant states within France, the number of suicides is very high, it's 190, whereas in the Catholic states it is very low, it is 58 or 40 if they are Greek Catholic states. So that's one piece of connection that he's been able to draw. Then he looks at suicides by ages of married and widowed persons, classified as with or without children. So you see that he is doing both men and women, and he is doing married with children, married without children, widowed with children, and widowed without children. And then very clearly the suicide rates are higher with those without children, whereas they are lower with those with children. So all of these statistics that he's gathering are bringing him to his theory. This is one where he draws from Morselli's work, who's a psychiatrist, an Italian psychiatrist, and who also had done statistical studies on this. This is on suicides in Central Europe. And once again, he sees that societies which are Protestant have a higher rate of suicide, whereas those that are Catholic have a lower rate of suicides. He's correlating suicides and size of families, and here he sees that larger families have a lower rate of suicide, whereas smaller families or not getting married, for example, have a higher rate of suicide. This is suicides committed by each sex per 10,000 inhabitants of each age and marital group during the period 1871 to 1885. And here again he compares unmarried, married, widowed, and does excellent statistical analysis on various populations. So from that, what he's coming to is two main things. He sees that societies which have a strong social cohesion or have a strong support system, have a collective consciousness, find meaning through this collective consciousness, are less likely to be suicidal, or the rates of suicide are lesser in those societies. On the other hand, which are less closely bound together, are higher in terms of the rates of suicide. So he takes two things. He takes integration and regulation, and then gives us 4 different kinds of suicide. So I will go one by one with examples of the 4 different kinds of suicides that Durkheim is talking about. All 4 of them hinged on 2 main factors: integration of society, and which means basically how does a society bind us, bind us in the good sense, like do we find meaning from our social relationships, do we have a better understanding of what is right and wrong from societal norms, and is there a collective space to grieve, to share joys with, and so on. So that is what he is characterizing as integration, social integration. But then as much as we derive meaning from society, society also regulates us. Societal norms also control us. So he's also looking at regulation and the extent to which, whether it's highly regulated society or less regulated society, and how that impacts the rates of suicide. So the first type of suicide that he talks about is egoistic suicide, where through analysis he finds that suicide varies inversely with the degree of integration of religious society. So if it is a well integrated religious society, then the suicide rates are low. Because through religion, and this is like, let's say he is finding this from his difference between Protestantism and Catholicism. Catholicism has more of a connection with the church. There is the notion of confession. There is a higher degree of collective spirit than amongst Protestantism. So that is one. For the other one, when he was looking at married, unmarried and all of that, he says suicide varies inversely with the degree of integration of domestic society. So a married person is less likely to commit suicide, especially those with children, because there is a sense of responsibility, there is a sense of togetherness, there is a sense of I have to take care of those close to me. Also, suicide varies inversely with the degree of integration of political society. So how cohesive is the group that binds you? How do you find meaning in your political society? Let's read out a quote from this section of his book. He writes, "First of all, it can be said that as a collective force is best calculated To restrain suicide, its weakening involves the development of suicide. When society is strongly integrated, it holds individuals under its control, considers them at its service, and thus forbids them to dispose willfully of themselves. And obviously, he shows that all religions are saying that suicide is not a good thing. That's what they preach. And yet, there are some religions where there is a higher rate of suicide and others where there is a lower rate of suicide. So he says that perhaps it could be, he's also correlating here. So he's also looking at, let's say, education. And he notices that if it is a religious society, and even in a religious society, if there are people who are lesser educated, they are lesser likely to commit suicide, and higher educated are more likely to commit suicide. Because perhaps he says the higher educated are also questioning religion and are questioning some of the social norms, and therefore find themselves without the possibility of finding meaning in those social structures. Although he says that there is one exception. He looks at the Jews, and he says that they are very strong in terms of their religious collectivity. They're also very highly educated, and yet their suicide rates are pretty low. And that he attributes to the idea that the Jewish usually educate themselves and read in order to know the scriptures better rather than to challenge them. He also points out that there are lesser number of suicide in Islamic society. So societies which bring people together, which are very strong in terms of their social integration, are less likely to have a higher rate of suicide than those that don't. The next suicide, he says, he calls it altruistic suicide. And altruistic suicide goes in the other direction. When somebody is so connected to the social that they belong to, that they fail to see themselves as an individual. The societal norm is bigger and higher to them than their own best interest. So this could be if a soldier is so connected to his country that he willingly gives up his life for his country, not strategically but willingly is sacrificing themselves for the sake of their country, then he says that is altruistic suicide, because the soldier is seeing herself or himself not as important as the larger social interest, right? He also gave an example of Hindu society and sati, where women at a particular historical period would willingly put themselves on the pyre with their departed husbands, because they did not see themselves as individuals, or they did not see their individuality as more important than the societal norm or what religious doctrines might be arguing. Let's read out what he has to say about altruism. He says, altruism expresses the state where the ego is not its own property, where it is blended with something not itself, where the goal of conduct is exterior to itself, that is, in one of the groups in which it participates. So we call this suicide caused by intense altruism, altruistic suicide. Let's go on to the next kind of suicide, and this he refers to as anomic suicide. Durkheim also defines the term anomy as those periods in society which are under a great upheaval, such that it's unclear what is expected behavior, what the right morals are, what is the norm, all of that gets shaken. So these periods, people are not able to find direction, they're not able to find meaning in things that they usually did. And those periods, or in those periods, if something goes really high, like let's say there is a certain norm that this is a typical rate of suicide in a particular society, and suddenly it goes up very high, that's a period of anomy. And so this kind of suicide he defines as anomic suicide, and it's in the word itself, right? It's not normal. Anomic, anomy, the word tells us what he's trying to say. But we'll read out what he's writing. He says the scale is upset. but the new scale cannot immediately be improvised. There are moments in societal transformation where certain structures are being challenged and are changing, but the new forms are not yet evident, right? We don't know what else to do if we don't do what we've been accustomed to doing for the past several years of our life. Time is required for the public consciousness to classify men and things. So long as the social forces thus freed have not regained equilibrium, their respective values are unknown, and so all regulation is lacking for the time. The limits are unknown between the possible and the impossible, what is just and unjust, between legitimate claims and hopes and those that are immoderate. Consequently, there is no restraint upon aspirations. Appetites not being controlled by public opinion become disoriented. And he gives the example of the several economic depressions, Wall Street crashes, where you're used to particular ways of living, you're used to certain aspirations, and then suddenly it all comes crashing down. So in such a period, the suicides that happen, he calls them anomic suicides. The last one, fatalistic suicide, this is not something that he dwells upon too much. In fact, it appears as a footnote in the book, but yet it is one of the 4 kinds of suicide. So a fatalistic suicide is when you don't see the future as having any hope. The sense of regulation is so tight, the control is so strong that you don't know whether you can ever get out of it. The examples for this would be somebody who's imprisoned for life in a very, very harsh condition, a slave who sees no chance for themselves to ever escape the situation that they are in, or somebody in a situation of immense domestic abuse where the control is so strong that they don't see any other way out and life seems so terrible in the current situation. So for fatalistic suicide, he writes, the above considerations show that there is a type of suicide, the opposite of anomic suicide. Just as egoistic and altruistic suicides are opposites, it is the suicide deriving from excessive regulation, that is, of persons with futures pitilessly blocked and passions violently choked by oppressive discipline. In order to kind of see these 4 suicides in relation to each other, I've tried to make this graphic, and if you put them in 2 dimensions, where one dimension is the degree of regulation in a particular society and the other dimension is the degree of integration in particular society. So we see that when regulation is very high and even integration is high, then it can be fatalistic suicide. When it's very low regulation, we don't know what is to be done, then it is anomic suicide. In situations of low integration, where societies are not cohesive, the collective consciousness is not very well developed, then it is egoistic suicide. And in very high integrated society, where you don't see the line between self and society, where the individual considers themselves less important than social norms, then it is altruistic suicide. So these are the 4 kinds of suicide he defines with examples and a lot of data in his book, in his study on suicide as a sociological inquiry. I want to end with this slide. It is not from Durkheim's book. In fact, it's a map from the World Health Organization showing 2015 data, age standardized suicide rates per 100,000 population for both sexes in the world. And you very clearly see that there are some parts of the world where it shows as very high rates of suicide, whereas other parts of the world show comparatively lower rates of suicide. And here you can very clearly see where we stand with our country, India. So I will leave you this map, but I've put up 2 questions here for you to think about. What possible inferences can you derive from a careful study of the map above? And what additional data might you need to to confirm whatever hypothesis you come up with. How would you, if you had to design a study on suicides in the contemporary world, in your current context, how would you go about designing such a study? So just something to think about, and with that, we end today's lecture. Thank you.